Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the All Time High podcast. I am your host, General Mort, and today we are going to be talking about if blockchain can lead to an entirely new internet. And honestly, I think it can. And I not only think it can, I think it will. Um, but first, obviously, let's touch on a couple news things. If you've been paying attention this week, you have seen that we've had a slight correction in the markets, which is okay. It's really fine, honestly. Um, Everything was kind of down about 25% this week, but price is not everything. And I would just always urge you guys to remember that invest in the tech, invest in the future. Price will come. Secondly, MicroStrategy once again is back in the news. They purchased another $1 billion in Bitcoin, and Square also jumped in and purchased $170 million of Bitcoin. So a lot more institutional interest coming through and people getting more involved as time goes on. But the most important news thing, in my opinion, from this week is that the Layer 2 scaling solution called Optimism is set to go live next month in March, which is 2 days away. So sometime in March, I think it's going to be towards the beginning, but this is super duper exciting because this is going to really help with all those problems with gas fees. Oops. So long story short, gas fees go down because of Optimism. So this is really, really exciting and could potentially mean kind of a breakout for Ethereum and the whole space, really, in general. But without further ado, let us continue into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to be talking about today, and that is, like I said, can blockchain create a new internet? But in order to do that, we got to understand a little bit more about the internet and exactly how that all works. So, to give you a brief overview of the internet is often described as a network of networks. And this is because, it's not like we're all connected to a single network when it comes to the internet. We're all connected to a bunch of different networks that are all interconnected and interoperable and, give us the experience that we know as the internet today. But this involves a combination of layers that kind of comprise the whole internet stack, right? So real quickly, let's talk about what those layers are. And this might be, a simple explanation of kind of how this works, but, I want to keep it simple. I honestly don't understand all this stuff myself, so want to make sure that I can communicate it properly. So at the base layer, at the bottom, we'll call this the network access layer. And this layer is essentially your actual physical access to the internet. So this is things like cable lines and satellites, whatnot. And then you've got the internet layer, which is the internet protocol. And then you've got the transport layer. And this basically facilitates the sending and receiving of data. Running out of room. And then at the top, you have the application layer. And the application layer basically is the layer in which you actually interact with on the internet. This is your web applications. This is all the stuff that we use to actually access the internet. These are interfaces built on top of all of this junk that makes the internet work, right? So, this combination of layers supports the facilitation of transfer of data, and like I said, we access these layers via applications, right? So typically in the internet these days, you have a client to server connection. So typically we're like the client, and we're going to connect to a host of servers that are usually stored or operated in a central location, right? The internet service providers are the ones who provide us this access, and this allows us to engage with the internet. And a lot of this data that's held in these application layers and stuff is hosted on centrally owned servers, right? So this is the exchange of data that is basically taking place every time that you interact with a web application, right? You're sending data to the server sending data back to you, and that's pretty much the whole process, right? This exchange of data between the user and the centrally hosted servers basically allows us access to their platform or their service. So we're more than likely feeding them data so that we can access what they're going to be using, and they might send us some back depending on what we're doing, right? So platforms kind of built on this infrastructure of the internet is known as Web 2.0. And Web 2.0 was basically the first like real evolution of the internet. Once it was possible, kind of, I would say probably in the late 90s, people started to figure out that they could do this, or rather, option to do this became available, right? So you've got Web 2.0, and this is basically the representation of web applications that we use today. Obviously, back in the late 90s, they were a lot more crude than they are now, but, this is things like Twitter and Facebook and Google and pretty much everything we know, right? And these are the application layer, right? So most of these include the harvesting of some user data to power their business. That's kind of like how Google uses your data to run their advertising platform, right? Google basically collects data about you, and then I wouldn't say they sell it. I mean, they might be selling it, who knows? But they basically utilize it to serve you targeted advertisements, right? Based on your browsing history and kind of how you interact with the web. So to continue, let's talk a little bit about like the infrastructural internet services. So actually, I'm gonna stay here real quick. So we talked about internet access. This network access layer is what we utilize to actually connect to the internet, right? So this includes anything like, say, fiber optic cable. These are cable lines that are running underground that help us connect. Or also satellite connections. And this is, I think, going to be more important very soon, or more prevalent, with Elon Musk Starlink. So this is, a different infrastructural opportunity to access the internet, right? Problem with this right now is this is heavily controlled by central authorities, right? And the telecom companies have basically a monopoly on access. This is why there isn't a whole lot of competition when it comes to internet service providers, is because people who want to compete sometimes just can't get access because they don't own the actual physical infrastructure, which is, in my opinion, a really, really big problem, which means, that our free market is not so free, right? So this is obviously one big problem with kind of how this is going, but then we also have things like the domain name services. And through the domain name services, we basically are given text-based URLs, right? That allow us to connect to different websites and different applications and stuff, right? So these text-based URLs are basically a evolution of IP addresses. In the earlier days of the internet, people actually connected to different web servers by literally inputting their IP address. And this might look like something like 192.168.0.108 or something like that. I don't know. And this is how people basically had access. So once the domain name servers kind of came in, then this became a much more easy way to kind of get involved and start actually using the internet. Now, at the highest level, DNS servers are basically managed by a company called ICANN. And ICANN stands for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. And these people basically issue these text-based URLs. These are the people that are kind of at the top managing all of this, right? But they don't really manage it all. This really kind of comes down to more so registry operators or registrars. And if you've ever bought a domain name or interacted with one or set one up, You're more familiar with this. This is stuff like GoDaddy or VeriSign. And, each of these different domain registry operators, they might handle their respective extensions like .com or .org or .gg or .io, whatever, right? So nobody technically really owns all of the domain names, but this is kind of a central point of failure, right? There is a central body that basically governs and controls this entire process, which I think is kind of not ideal, right? So in addition to those two things, you also have things like web hosting and data storage. So web hosting and data storage, there are various types of servers that store and manage data, but you may be more familiar with stuff like Bluehost or AWS or Cloudflare. And in terms of data storage, even things like, Google Drive or Dropbox. And you are basically engaging with these services by providing data, or they might be processing data for you, things like AWS, and they're storing data for you, right? So these are kind of some of the infrastructural services that you might actually interact with when it comes to the internet. Now, I would like to highlight some of these inefficiencies and problems. So now that we kind of have at least a somewhat decent understanding of how the internet works and how you interact with it, I'd like to talk about why it's not the best. So, So there are a couple primary things that I want to talk about, and first I want to talk about heavy centralization. Now, what I mean by this is essentially that not just the applications and programs and software themselves that are heavily centralized, but the actual whole infrastructure is deeply centralized, right? There are several companies and corporations that exert control over different parts of the process, and basically, in other words, own the current web infrastructure. These people tend to collect and harvest user data, and it's stored in centrally located servers that could potentially fail, right? And if they fail, you lose everything. So due to the heavy centralization, you now have a central point of failure, right? In other words, these are servers that could be hacked, or data that could be hacked and stolen, or misused in malicious ways. You don't really know, but of course, companies have protections against failures or hacks, like DDoS attacks and other mechanisms that can cause service interruptions. But it's still a central point of failure. There is still something that can be attacked, and your service can be disrupted. I'm not sure about you guys, but I have definitely experienced when either a game or a web company that I'm trying to interact with is DDoSed, and their service no longer becomes usable, and it just completely fails, right? This is a definite severe problem. This has led to a lot of things like identity theft and just general stealing of account information. And this is, to me, just a significant problem that continues to plague the internet right now, right? So next, let's talk about censorship. So this has been a really hot topic these days, and primarily because we've now launched all these social networks, and the world is more social than it's ever been, and it's more connected than it's ever been. It also means that people have a voice when maybe they previously didn't. But it also means that the people who own those companies can silence you if they so choose. They're not obligated to let you say whatever you want on their platform because they own it. So, whether you agree with it or not, Twitter going out and banning people for saying certain things, to me, is a problem. I think that, except in the extreme cases of inciting violence and actively, threatening people or trying to dox them, people should be allowed to say pretty much whatever the hell they want. And if you don't like it, you can block them, you can ignore them. We don't have to give attention to people who say inflammatory things, but that's just kind of the nature of what's been going on, right? So because of this centralized ownership, these companies can determine whether or not you have access to their platform, right? They can block your IP address, they can ban your account, and they can completely eliminate your access to their platform. So you might even be banned wrongly. This happens a lot in gaming. People get banned because their software detection or their hack detection software detects something that isn't really a hack, but maybe an application that's running on your computer, and they ban you. And then it's incredibly difficult to lift that ban and get that reversed because, more than likely their support system just sucks. So this to me is a really big problem, and you have sometimes people getting banned off of certain platforms for saying certain things, and sometimes for things that are not even that serious and maybe are misinterpreted or misunderstood, and definitely aren't inciting hate or violence, right? So censorship, definitely a big problem, right? And then we talk about data ownership. This is another really hot topic in the current web ecosystem. And, laws like the California privacy law or GDPR are definitely trying to mitigate some of the concerns with data ownership, but personally not really sure if they're going about it the right way and not really sure if it's really possible. When you engage with a web platform, you always have to confirm that you've read their TOS, their terms of service. Nobody ever reads this. But this more than likely outlines, for the most part, how they're going to use your data and, might also say how they're going to profit from it, right? But either way, there are a lot of data companies or web companies that rely on the collection of your data to power their business models. So things like Google and Facebook really, honestly, would not be around without how they use their user data. They're able to take that data and monetize it basically by inadvertently selling it to advertisers so that they can serve you targeted advertisements, right? Selling, maybe not the best word, but putting it to use. The problem with this is that you don't get anything out of that exchange. You are just freely giving away all your shit. And that sucks. I think that's really awful, and it makes people feel really uncomfortable, right? I think there's a difference in sentiment when you think about how your data is being used. If collected with maybe with your permission but not your authorization, I don't know how to really say that, but they're collecting your data and you're not going to get anything from it. So that exchange doesn't feel good. And then you also have to think about the fact that people are really uncomfortable thinking that there's somebody out there looking at their personal life, right? I'll be honest, I don't think that's typically the case, really, especially when it comes to advertising technology. A lot of this stuff is all just numbers and letters, but at the end of the day, still, it doesn't feel good that somebody else is profiting off of your identity, which feels really bad, right? So without their data, some of these companies just wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be able to stay profitable because it's such a large part of their market. So right now, like I mentioned, there is regulation, but this regulation is more about how your data is used, not really who owns it. And ownership is really the core thing here. We want to have ownership of our data, because why should we let Google and Facebook profit from our data when we should be profiting from our data? It's ours, isn't it? So this is definitely a significant problem, and I think that you guys are going to be excited to hear kind of how blockchain can fix this, right? So Bitcoin and blockchain are basically peer-to-peer networks, right? And peer-to-peer networks have actually been around for quite some time. And in the earliest days of the internet, there were a lot of peer-to-peer networks. Remember I mentioned earlier how people would connect to basically different forums and stuff via the IP address. So the concept necessarily, or rather, The concept of a peer-to-peer network is not exactly new. And, you may remember certain services like Napster or Pirate Bay or uTorrent. These are all basically peer-to-peer networks and applications, right? This involves the exchange of data between individual peers, individual nodes. We're not kind of really interacting with a central server. We're all kind of sharing data via this peer-to-peer network. So if you are a computer here, you're basically talking to all these computers to share different data and whatnot, right? So the problem with kind of how peer-to-peer networks initially came about really kind of has to do with the fact that there's no security. So you might, if you're brave enough, be willing to interact with these networks, but problem is you can't guarantee the security of the data that you're accessing, can't really guarantee the security of your own data, and you kind of end up with this system that just does not prevent bad actors, right? And because they don't prevent bad actors, you could potentially get screwed. Your data could get stolen, your identity could get stolen, you might download a file that you think is fine, but it's actually a virus. So this involves a significant amount of trust in the platform. You are basically trusting that not just the platform, but you're trusting that these individual nodes are going to be honest and share the data that you believe that you're downloading, right? So this concept of trust is really, really important because right now, big reason that we trust a lot of these central entities is because they're companies, they're verified and they're filed with the government and all this stuff. So, there is a certain level of trust that we have, but at the same time, we don't trust them because we don't trust what they're doing with our data, right? So peer-to-peer networks were really, are a very fascinating concept. The problem is this lack of security and this basically absence of trust. We're not preventing people from doing malicious things on these networks because they're kind of designed to just be entirely free, right? So Bitcoin kind of represents a new evolution of this type of network. And it's important to talk about Bitcoin here because Bitcoin was really the first blockchain network to solve this problem. And this problem is called consensus. And basically, the idea behind consensus is that these different nodes that are all in this network can agree on a certain set of rules, basically without having to interact with each other, all automatically in a secure, cryptographically secure way that creates immutable data, right? This is not really possible in this sense because there's no active involvement between each of these nodes that's checking for this, right? And because Bitcoin solved this consensus problem, it's really actually called the Byzantine generals problem. And without going too in-depth on this, the Byzantine generals problem basically involves a group of parties that are agreeing to a collective truth while simultaneously eliminating false information. So to put that into perspective on Bitcoin, you're basically saying that Bitcoin is going to agree on these transactions happening and that they are true while also simultaneously weeding out fraudulent activity. Basically checking for it and saying, all right, well, we see that that's not a valid transaction, so we're going to reject it as a network. We can all agree that that's bullshit. We're going to throw it out. And that's really a novel concept. This is all done automatically. This is just by the process of how the software works, which is really fascinating to me. It's not like there's a bunch of people sitting at their computers looking at transactions and going, I see that one's wrong, we're going to take that one out. No, it's just you hook up to the network and the network self-corrects. It self-adjusts and it basically talks to each other to make sure that there's no malicious activity going on. That's crazy to me, and I think it's really exciting. So this makes Bitcoin a trustless network. So I'm not really trusting that the individual node operators are going to process my transactions and verify that they're true. I'm trusting that Bitcoin as a network is going to ensure that my transactions are secure and they're safe and they're immutable forever, right? So this basically means that a collection of computers can all agree that these transactions are verifiably true. So using this innovation, there are basically being new applications that are being built on blockchain using it as the infrastructural layer, right? So now we're talking about blockchain as the infrastructural layer. Now, the problem is Bitcoin doesn't do a great job of being the infrastructural layer. Bitcoin, because of the way it was designed, is kind of only built to do one thing. So it's not really going to push us forward in terms of stuff like a decentralized internet or Web 3.0, right? But what this means for us is that we no longer need centralized authorities or intermediaries to verify the authenticity of our data, of our transactions, and our identities. We can build networks that self-correct, that do it automatically, that really don't require nearly as much maintenance or as many, transferring of ownership, right? So let's talk about the decentralized web. So it's possible you may have heard the term Web 3.0. And Web 3.0 is basically supposed to be the next evolution of the internet, taking us to basically an entirely new type of internet that changes the way that we interact with it and what it does for us, right? So the future of the internet, in my opinion, is going to use blockchain as the backbone. And because of this consensus, these consensus mechanisms, they can check against themselves. So you can actually create a truly decentralized, democratized platform that you can also trust, or rather don't have to trust, right? So with blockchain as the backbone, this is going to open up a whole new, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a whole new type of possibility for the internet, right? So right now, like I mentioned, the application layer that we know for the internet is called Web 2.0. And Web 3.0, a lot is, people describe this as the application layer for the new web. And these are usually in the form of dApps, which are decentralized applications, right? So I think that, basically these applications being built on top of this infrastructure is going to be, Web 3.0. So we talked about the kind of like the stacks and the layers of the current internet, but let's talk about what it looks like in terms of blockchain. So at the base layer, you have your layer 1 protocols or actual blockchains. And these are things like both Ethereum and Bitcoin are their own individual blockchains. Whoa. Okay, I can't. Yeah. All right. So each of these are their own individual blockchains. So this is stuff like Ethereum and Bitcoin. And then on the next layer, but this is where we lose Bitcoin a little bit, because as you go through the layers, Bitcoin kind of loses these functionalities. So think of this more in terms of Ethereum. So next you've got the asset layer. And this is basically assets that are built or used on the network. So this is Ethereum, but this is also all of the ERC20 tokens that are built on Ethereum, all of the ERC 721 tokens or NFTs that are built on Ethereum. And this is basically just the actual balance and checking of the actual assets themselves. But up one more from that, you have the protocol layer. And these are additional decentralized protocols that are built on top of the Ethereum blockchain or whatever blockchain you're talking about. So, this is basically a fundamental, what's the word I'm looking for? It's basically a representation of new applications, but this doesn't provide access. Is kind of the point, right? You got to go one more layer up for application access. So now we get to applications, and these are the things that we're going to interact with, right? These are going to be the new web applications of the future. You know, your social media and your finance apps that basically were previously run on centralized servers. But there is one more layer, and this layer is fascinating. And I think this is something that like the internet doesn't really lend itself to right now. And we got aggregators, and aggregators are basically, you know, projects or companies or protocols that are taking a bunch of existing stuff, a bunch of these existing applications, and kind of mashing them together to make their own stuff, which I think is really cool. So that's kind of the blockchain stack in a nutshell. And I mentioned that Ethereum is kind of the most powerful infrastructural concept here, right? So right now, these dApps that are being built, most of them use Ethereum as their backbone. Ethereum is kind of like the engine that powers their application. It's the meat and potatoes, right? And the Ethereum blockchain basically guarantees any app that's built on top of it the security and the security and transparency of that network. So you kind of get the full benefits of Ethereum by building an application on Ethereum, if that makes sense. So DeFi, which I've talked about in the past, decentralized finance, is a really good example of how Web 3.0 is breaking into the mainstream. And this is coming via basically decentralized financial applications that are giving people who didn't previously have it financial sovereignty or an opportunity to participate in a new type of financial system, right? What I find really fascinating about this is that interacting with Web 3.0 applications, most of them, no personal data. And think about that for a second. When's the last time you accessed a web application that didn't ask you for a username, an email, password, sometimes even your address, your location information? These applications don't ask you any of that. In fact, you have kind of an entirely different way of connecting to it, which I think is fascinating. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so you have no personal data, which is really cool because they don't need it. The next thing is also that this enables for the possibility of community-run applications. And I quite literally mean applications that are built, governed, and maintained by the community themselves. Right now, there have been some attempts at this. Stuff like Wikipedia, you know, is mostly kind of community-run, right? Everybody can contribute. But there's not a good way to monetize this. And that makes it really hard to kind of keep Wikipedia up. That's why you always get those damn notifications saying, you know, we love you, please donate to us. So decentralization kind of fixes this problem and gives us new opportunities for both ownership and monetization. And monetization, I don't necessarily even mean on the side of the platform. I actually mean also in the case of the users. The users might actually monetize by interacting with these platforms. You might actually make money by going on, you know, Facebook or Twitter or Reddit in the future, right? And lastly, last little thing I want to talk about with this is name servers. So we talked about domain name servers and basically how that was the next step for people to be able to engage in the internet in kind of an open way or a way that made sense with text-based URLs. But this will also happen on blockchain. And projects like the Ethereum name servers basically allow you to go reserve your Ethereum name. And this decentralizes kind of that DNS process that we were talking about earlier and kind of allows for everybody to participate and be a part of it. So beyond just an actual decentralized web from an interface standpoint and an application standpoint, there is a possibility for us to have a whole new internet infrastructure. So what would it take to have a decentralized infrastructure? I mentioned to you right now that like the telecom companies own all of the boxes and the fiber optic networks, so we can't exactly decentralize that. They're never gonna, give up ownership of that stuff because it makes them absurd amounts of money, right? So like I mentioned, Web 3.0 basically mostly represents the decentralization of web applications, but there is a possibility to decentralize the infrastructure as well. One project that I think is really interesting is called Helium. And these guys have basically built a different type of consensus mechanism. It's called proof of coverage. And without going too much into detail on that, what this basically means is that they're going to let people host their own nodes that will provide web access to people around them. I think they've basically produced these really high range Wi-Fi nodes, and basically by owning one and just hosting it in your home, you're going to make money. You're going to be paid out in their token because you're providing a service. And users that are connecting to your service are basically helping to contribute to that whole network, right? So this is a complete deviation from what we currently know, because what this does is it completely democratizes ownership. So now, when we interact with our internet service providers, they own everything. They own top to bottom, pretty much. They own everything, right? But this is actually an opportunity to democratize the ownership of the internet. And this will mean that people won't be able to limit your access or censor you, and kind of stop the way that you want to interact with the internet, right? So we ultimately might end up with a peer-to-peer network that supports the actual infrastructure of the internet, and could ultimately replace the entire infrastructure of our internet. I think one interesting point here is that we're getting closer and closer to what people are calling the Internet of Things. And this is basically the idea that like every device with a chip in it will be interconnected in some way in the future. And that might be propping up something like a new internet. There will be other things that are happening with, very quick transfers of data, of small amounts of information and small amounts of money. But I don't see any reason why this can't help support this entire infrastructure, right? So I'm really excited to see kind of how that develops. But, the primary benefits that I want you guys to take away from Web 3.0 and a decentralized web are these. And, oops. So the three primary benefits I think that you should be concerned with are that it is decentralized. So obviously this means that nobody owns the applications themselves even. Nobody owns your data. This is all kind of broken up, right? Everything is democratized. It is censorship resistant. And this means that people can't take your tweets down. They can't ban you from their platform. They can't restrict what you say. And the community will likely self-regulate in terms of that. If there's really something out there or somebody out there who's being a particularly bad actor, the community will find a way to handle it. So I think this is an incredibly powerful concept, right? And then lastly, it is permissionless. And this means that you can't tell anybody that they can't go on your platform. They can't interact with your product. Think about like China and the Great Firewall they have, right? They restrict an incredible amount of access to the internet, and they really limit you on what you can interact with, what you can do. And that's just simply ridiculous to me. I should be able to do whatever I want on the internet. The internet is awesome. The internet represents the greatest and fastest exchange of information in fucking human history. So we need these things. We need to be permissionless. We can't rely on censorship for certain parties to control certain narratives, and it needs to be decentralized so that we can ensure these things, that we can make sure that we're not being, for lack of a better term, fucked, right? So I really see that the evolution of the internet is coming very quickly. Seeing apps like Uniswap and Aave and even other games like Axie Infinity or CryptoKitties, like these games have real people that are using them. And the only limitation to me right now is partially due to high gas fees, mainly on the Ethereum network. But Ethereum has so many people building on it that it would be hard to imagine it failing. I mean, there are literally thousands of web applications right now that are all kind of running on this infrastructure. And you've got a bunch of different categories. You've got games, you've got social networks, you have financial platforms, so DeFi, and you've also got NFTs and collectibles. So these are things like, digital art or trading cards, stuff like that. And just to give you guys some examples, games, might want to check out like Axie Infinity or Gods Unchained. For social networks, PeertoPeer and Steemit are great examples. I already mentioned Aave, Compound. And then for NFTs and collectibles, stuff like Rarible or OpenSea. Sorry, guys, my handwriting is very, very poor. I hate this thing. I gotta get a new one. And this is only a fraction of what's going on. There are things that I don't even like, types of applications that I can't even think of because they don't exist yet, right? And I think one of the most awesome parts about this is kind of that they all work together, right? So I mentioned earlier that, you don't even need like an email and password when you log into these things. It's actually pretty cool, and it's really fascinating. You basically log in with your wallet. So you've got this wallet that basically shows all of the assets that you own, right? And when you connect to a new Web 3.0 application, it'll likely say something like start crypto wallets or log in through MetaMask. And MetaMask is basically a browser-based wallet. And all you got to do is, input your password, get access to your wallet on MetaMask, and then approve that you're letting the site read your wallet data. Now, a really important part of this is this does not mean that they get access to what's in your wallet. All it means is that they can read what's in your wallet. So they can really just check what assets you have so that you can start to interact with the platform. Now, one of the most exciting things about what Web 3.0, or actually really two of the most exciting things about what Web 3.0 represent, are two concepts known as composibility and interoperability. And they're similar, but there are some key distinctions. So, composibility basically is the idea that every single application or open source software that's built on these networks are like Lego pieces. And people can take these Lego pieces and stack them together and combine them to create entirely new things. That's kind of like what we were talking about when we were talking about with the aggregators. Is people taking all these applications, smashing them together, and creating whole new different things. It's really wild. That's really, really cool to me because, think about it like in terms of like the modding community for Skyrim or other video games. Like they basically are taking those Lego pieces that are inside the game, those assets, and creating entirely new games or new opportunities, new experiences. So blockchain is built on this idea of composibility, of allowing people to take what you've made and make new shit. And then we talk about interoperability. And this is basically transfer of data between blockchains and platforms. So you are also creating a system that allows for your software to be more easily integrated or read or just interactive with other ones, right? So this is a really, really large deviation from what we know. A lot of these big software companies, they build their applications and you don't really know how they're built or what exactly the application is doing with maybe your data. And this is just an entire, or rather a complete deviation from that. This really is completely decentralizing this entire process. And that's crazy to me and really exciting. And I think it's inevitable. I think once people start to realize that this is a possibility, what other reason would there be to stay with what we currently have other than it's just that what we're comfortable with? Obviously change is hard, but I think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to happen fast, and I think it's going to be explosive, and I think it's going to be really fun. So I hope that you guys are excited about it. I hope that this gave you a pretty good insight on kind of what the horizon looks like for the internet, and I hope that you take advantage of where we're at right now and get involved. I've said this before, but I truly believe that if you were to compare blockchain to the earlier days of the internet, we're probably in like maybe the early 2000s, which is kind of before the MySpace and Facebook boom, before the app, marketplace changed everything. We are early, but I do expect this to evolve way faster than the internet. So, this might be where we're at now, but we might find ourselves in 2010 by summer or 2008 or something. I don't know. So I expect things to move very quickly, and I expect it to be a very rapid and exciting change. So that's pretty much it for me today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you guys enjoyed it, of course, please like, subscribe, follow, and all that shit. Of course, tell me about you, or oh god, tell your friends about me if you think they'd find this stuff interesting, and check the info panel below if you guys want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram or any of this stuff. I will hang around for a little bit if anybody has any questions. Tell me about your favorite projects and whatnot. But more than anything, thank you everybody, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you guys next time.